Detection July 1925. At the top of Mauna Kea, the air was still and transparent, and the stars hung in the sky almost without trembling. The shift on duty at the Pan-STARRS Observatory was checking the routine observation sector, searching for small bodies at the intersection of the orbits of Earth and Mars. Everything was going as usual until one of the automatic filters detected a faint dot that had shifted against the background of the stars too fast to be an asteroid. The coordinates were recalculated twice, then 3 times. They stared at the screen in silence. The orbit parameters did not match any known model. The eccentricity exceeded 1. This meant one thing: the object did not belong to the solar system. He flew along a hyperbolic trajectory, entering from interstellar space, and after a short visit had to go back, forever. At first, no one paid any attention. Several such anomalies have already occurred, but calculations have shown that the direction of arrival is from the galactic antiperigelian region, from the most deserted part of the star field, where even the background radiation is thinning. That's not how rocks fly. This is how something moves, which had an impulse set far beyond the gravity of the stars. A day later, the European network confirmed the observation. The object was given a name: Atlas. That was the name of the automatic telescope that was the first to detect its movement. The new catalog number sounded dry and precise: 3I/Atlas, the third registered interstellar wanderer. But the strangeness was just beginning. Spectral analysis showed that there is no water in the composition. No trace of ice, no dust, no familiar comet tail. Just carbon dioxide and dark carbon, almost a stone monolith. A comet without breathing. Dead ice.
When the surface temperature rose, activity did not increase, but rather decreased. The object became darker, as if it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The brightness decreased contrary to the laws of thermodynamics. There was no explanation. By mid-August, Atlas had crossed the orbit of Mars. Then they managed to photograph him in close-up. It turned out not to be an irregular lump of rock, as expected, but a body of almost perfect shape, a hexagon like a crystal. Its edge shone dully, but smoothly, like polished metal. The magnetometers detected a weak but stable field. This is not typical for comets. The scientists were silent at first, then they started arguing. Some said that the shape was random, that the observation was distorted by an angle. Others noted too precise angles, too smooth lines. In early September, a thin halo appeared around the core. The gas did not spread out, as in ordinary comets, but gathered into a closed cloud, pulsating with a clear rhythm, once every 2 minutes or so. The frequency did not change day or night, or when the viewing angle changed. It was a steady periodicity like a heartbeat. The instruments detected a slight radio frequency fluctuation on the hydrogen line. They recorded and forgot there are a lot of background noises in space. But someone noted in the report a coincidence between the pulse frequency and the pulsation rate of the halo. Subsequently, this line will be quoted by many. In autumn, Atlas was approaching the sun. Predictions showed that on October 29th, it would pass behind the sun's disk and disappear from view for almost a day. It was the expected moment of maximum activity. Telescopes around the world were preparing to observe the flare, which is usually accompanied by such flights. At 3:42 GMT, the sun blinded the cameras. The recording was interrupted for a few minutes. When the light noise dissipated, the instruments caught a short, sharp burst. It lasted less than 20 minutes, but was 4 times brighter than the calculated one. The shape of the ejection was not chaotic, as in ordinary gas jets, but surprisingly orderly, 6 rays radiating from the center at exactly 60 degrees. After a minute, everything stopped. The object disappeared behind the sun's disk and never appeared again. The data went silent. At first, it was thought that he had broken up, but the gravity models showed no traces of fragments, no dust trail, no residual glow. It was as if the body had simply ceased to exist. On the same night, the Deep Space Network Control Center in Madrid recorded a barely noticeable deviation in the spectrum of the cosmic background. 3 short pulses, 1 long pulse. Everything is on the frequency of hydrogen. Too weak to make out the structure, but clear enough to be noted in the protocol. He was written off as a nuisance. The recording was later re-listened to. The pulses were repeated exactly 126 seconds later, the same rhythm that was observed earlier at Atlas. The comet disappeared, but the rhythm remained. That's how a story began that shouldn't have happened. The story of an object that came from the void, entered the light and left behind only a breath, 3 short, 1 long. And with that breath, everything else began. Perihelion. By the time 3 Atlas reached perihelion, the solar observatories were ready. Every major instrument pointed toward the inner system, tracking the visitor as it slipped into the blinding halo of the sun. From Earth's perspective, it was almost gone, a shadow grazing the solar fire. But the data kept coming. The object had grown brighter, much brighter than any thermal model allowed. In the control rooms, the monitors glowed with graphs. Smooth curves that suddenly rose, bent, and then broke into vertical cliffs. A flare, impossible in scale, erupted from the object's position. For 20 minutes, 3 Atlas shone 4 times brighter than physics could explain. Then it fell silent. What the telescope saw wasn't chaos. It was geometry. The outburst expanded evenly, not like an explosion but like a wavefront, smooth and symmetric. 6 arcs of light radiated outward, faint but precise, forming a hexagon in the solar glare. Instruments on the solar orbiter recorded the edges of the pattern, 6 directions, evenly spaced, rotating almost imperceptibly around the nucleus. Astronomers called it the shell, a sphere of ionized gas nearly 20,000 kilometers wide, expanding, freezing, then collapsing in on itself like a breathing lung of light. In that short span, the magnetic field around the comet spiked, and for a few minutes, the local solar wind density dropped, as though something had pushed it aside. When the glare subsided, the object was dimmer than before. The shell had vanished, but its orbit had changed. The shift was small, subtle, just enough to tell the story. 3 Atlas had felt the sun and, somehow, pushed back. In Pasadena, Darmstadt, and Tokyo, analysts stared at their screens. The math was flawless. The shift was real. The acceleration vector didn't match the direction of the outburst. It wasn't recoil. It was control. The debate fractured overnight. Some said it was natural, a catastrophic venting of trapped carbon dioxide. Others whispered about magnetic coupling, plasma symmetry, or an entirely new class of interstellar matter. But when the first processed images from SOHO arrived, the conversation changed again. Their faint but undeniable was the hexagonal pattern. Not random, not turbulent, structured. In plasma physics, hexagonal symmetry can emerge from standing wave interference, fields locked in phase, balancing perfectly for brief moments before collapsing. It was something that had never been seen in a comet. Not in any comet. And then came the silence. During the peak of the flare, the LASCO coronagraph aboard SOHO stopped transmitting data. 47 seconds of nothing. A gap in the timeline right when the brightness peaked. When the feed resumed, the structure of the corona had changed. The background plasma field looked subtly rearranged, as if a shockwave had passed unseen. The official explanation spoke of sensor protection, of automatic exposure safeties triggered by excess light. But when independent engineers examined the telemetry, the story didn't hold. The sensors had not saturated. They had paused, manually by command. Only there had been no command. For the next 72 hours, 3 Atlas remained invisible, lost in the glare. The light curve flattened. The radio silence deepened. And then, just as abruptly, it reappeared, faint, cold, moving slightly off its projected path. Infrared data showed a rapid drop in surface temperature, faster than radiative cooling could produce. Something was draining heat away. The emission lines of carbon dioxide were gone. The coma had collapsed completely, and yet, a pulse remained. A flicker in reflected sunlight every 126.2 seconds, steady as a metronome. That number haunted the data teams. It matched the rhythm of the pre-perihelion activity, the same periodic glow seen months before. The comet's nucleus was no longer active, no longer outgassing, and still it pulsed. Some suggested rotation, but the timing didn't fit. The period was too precise, too unchanging. Others speculated internal oscillations, perhaps caused by residual magnetic stress. But privately, among a handful of physicists who still watched the telemetry late at night, a different theory began to take shape, one they didn't dare publish. What if the flare had not been a failure, but a process? What if the outburst was the moment the object changed its state? Matter crossing a boundary we had no name for. A transformation, not destruction. In that scenario, the flare was not energy released, but energy reorganized. The symmetry wasn't coincidence, it was structure. And the pulse wasn't a heartbeat, it was a signal. By the time the last fragments of data were archived, the object had moved past the sun and was drifting outward. The trajectory was no longer hyperbolic. Its eccentricity had dropped below 1. By definition, that meant only one thing. 3 Atlas was no longer leaving. It had become bound. The signal. 3 weeks after perihelion, the Deep Space Network picked up the first anomaly. It came from the Madrid complex, a narrowband emission near 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, buried deep in background noise. At first, the pattern looked like interference. A technician almost deleted the file. But when the same signal appeared with identical timing, in the Canberra logs 12 hours later, someone finally looked closer. It wasn't random. The waveform repeated every 126.2 seconds, precisely matching the post-perihelion pulse observed in the optical data. A faint, deliberate rhythm anchored to the frequency of hydrogen, the universal constant of the cosmos. The data was passed to the SETI servers for verification. Within hours, a protocol chain activated automatically, flagging the source as non-terrestrial, non-solar, structured. The first classification of its kind since the inception of the modern search programs. Then the message stopped. For 78 hours, the sky was silent. When the signal returned, it came stronger, narrow, coherent, with a sharp frequency drift corresponding exactly to the known trajectory of 3 Atlas. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the math spoke for itself. The source was moving with the object. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the data was reconstructed into a dynamic spectrogram. On the display, a faint modulation shimmered through the static 3 short bursts followed by 1 long. 3 pause 1. Repeating. The same sequence detected months earlier in the cosmic microwave background, now back again, clearer. To confirm directionality, the network triangulated using 3 stations, Goldstone, Canberra, and Hartbeespoort in South Africa. The intersection point landed not in deep space, not in the sun's wake, but precisely along the path of the object now labeled 3I, Atlas by the Minor Planet Center. The alignment was perfect within the error margin of a few kilometers. It was transmitting, but to what, or from what? The carrier signal was pure, mathematically clean, no amplitude noise, no sidebands. The modulation existed not in amplitude but in frequency, as if each pulse slightly bent the hydrogen line itself. Quantum interference at that precision required energy control beyond any human engineering. The first to notice the deeper structure was Dr. Rina Ortega, a radiophysicist from the University of Chile. Running the raw data through an autocorrelation algorithm, she saw subpatterns within the main rhythm, not random gaps but ratios. The pulse intervals corresponded to the spectral fingerprints of the 6 most common isotopes of carbon. Carbon, the foundation of life, could have been coincidence, but the precision was unnerving down to the 6th decimal of frequency drift. Every pattern repeated exactly every 12 cycles. Like a loop, when the finding reached the International Astronomical Union, it triggered the Emergency Review Protocol ECHO. That procedure had never been used before. It allowed for restricted communication between observatories under encrypted transmission, bypassing public feeds. Officially, no one outside the network knew anything. Unofficially, fragments began to leak. Anonymous posts on physics forums mentioned an artificial symmetry. Encrypted emails spoke of controlled hydrogen entanglement. Then came the visual anomaly. The James Webb Space Telescope, scanning the post-perihelion debris field, recorded a residual glow near the projected coordinates of 3 Atlas. It wasn't visible light. It was infrared, faint, uniform, constant. The shape, when enhanced, resembled not a point but a lattice, 6 nodes connected by thin bridges of energy. 6 points, 6 directions. The same geometry that had appeared during the solar flare. The glow persisted for exactly 8 hours, then faded. And at the exact moment of its disappearance, the hydrogen line emission ceased. No one could explain the synchronization. Some believed the event marked the final decay of the object, the last whisper of an interstellar relic burning out. Others thought it was the beginning of something. 2 months later, when Earth crossed the same orbital longitude where 3 Atlas had passed, radio telescopes picked up the signal again. Weaker, scattered, not from a point but from everywhere at once. As if space itself remembered. The pulses were slower now. 3 short, 1 long. Always the same. No data packet, no modulation key, no meaning to decode. Just repetition, endlessly patient. As though the message wasn't meant to be read. Only noticed. Afterward, observatories began to report subtle magnetic deviations. Tiny fluctuations, synchronized with the 126-second rhythm, detected in instruments all across the planet. No clear cause, no interference source. The field lines seemed to breathe. By late spring, the background hum of the universe had shifted slightly, imperceptible to most instruments, but measurable to the most sensitive receivers. A soft resonance near the hydrogen frequency spread through every spectrum at once. 3 Atlas was gone, and yet, in the silence between transmissions, something remained. Not an object, presence, resonance. By mid-year, the signal had become background. It wasn't something you could isolate anymore. Not a narrow beam, not a discrete pulse. It had dissolved into the spectrum itself, woven into the cosmic static like an echo that refused to fade. At first, only the radio observatories noticed. Then the magnetometers began to drift. Then the tides. It started with microvariations, oscillations in the geomagnetic field, perfectly synchronized to the 126.2-second interval. The amplitude was negligible, almost invisible, but the phase was exact. Every continent, every sensor, locked to the same rhythm. Earth was resonating. In Boulder, Colorado, the NOAA Geomagnetic Lab flagged the anomaly as an instrumental artifact. They recalibrated twice, replaced hardware, and ran isolation tests. The oscillation persisted. It wasn't noise. It was real. When cross-referenced with space-based magnetometers aboard the GO satellites, the same pattern appeared in orbit, identical phase, identical period. The signal wasn't coming from space anymore. It was passing through space. On August 9th, the European Space Agency's Gaia Observatory detected a subtle deviation in stellar parallax measurements. Stars within a narrow band of declination exhibited an unexplained microlensing effect, as though space-time itself was trembling. The amplitude matched the magnetic oscillations on Earth. By then, the term resonance field had entered internal memos. No one wanted to call it communication, but no one could define it otherwise. At the Deep Space Network, the telemetry logs began to show phantom packets, data bursts that didn't originate from any registered spacecraft. Each packet was precisely 126.2 seconds apart, time-stamped to atomic precision, yet contained no recognizable code. Binary noise, perfectly symmetrical in entropy, meaningless except for the fact that it existed at all. In Cambridge, an independent astrophysicist named Dr. Naomi Laird ran a frequency decomposition on months of atmospheric VLF recordings. The results showed something no one expected. The Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, had split into 6 harmonic peaks. 6. Always 6. Each new frequency was faint, like a whisper beneath the storm, but stable, and their amplitude grew. Tiny, predictable surges rolling through the atmosphere, through oceans, through the ionosphere itself, as if the planet had synchronized with something larger. The press never heard about it. Not at first. Officially, the world was preoccupied with other crises, weather anomalies, supply failures, a brief solar minimum that no model had predicted. But behind closed doors, observatories and research institutes coordinated silently under an old and forgotten protocol, Echo 2. The goal wasn't to solve the anomaly. It was to keep watching. In September, a team at JPL attempted to recreate the hydrogen line signal using controlled plasma fields. Their experiment lasted only 12 minutes before the containment failed. The magnetic field collapsed into a self-organizing pattern, 6 nodes, rotating, stable for several seconds before disintegrating. It matched the geometry of the Atlas flare. After that, the experiment was never repeated. Meanwhile, deep in the South Pacific, seismic sensors began to pick up microtremors that didn't correspond to tectonic activity. Every 2 minutes and 6 seconds, a pulse, faint, uniform, global. The ocean floor was humming. Some scientists started calling it the memory, as if the planet itself was remembering the pattern burned into the solar wind months before. When analyzed, the frequency ratios between the magnetic field, the Schumann harmonics, and the seismic pulses formed a single harmonic series. It was music, structured, mathematical, but not human. The implications were unbearable. If resonance had emerged spontaneously, it meant the signal was not a transmission, but a reaction, a standing wave forming between the Earth and something else, something vast. In November, a small research facility in northern Chile detected a faint beam of coherent microwave radiation, descending from the ionosphere, locked exactly on 1420 MHz. For 12 seconds, it pulsed in the Atlas pattern, 3 short, 1 long, before dissolving into the background again. The beam was directed downward, not from space, from above the planet's own atmosphere. When the data reached the network, every secure line went silent. No statement was issued, no publication followed. But those who saw the data knew the resonance had crossed the threshold. Earth was no longer listening, it was speaking. The memory. By the first quarter of the following year, the resonance had become part of the world's natural rhythm. It no longer registered as an event. It was simply there, like gravity or background radiation, unnoticed by most, yet quietly adjusting the machinery of precision timekeeping, satellite guidance, even biological cycles. Clocks began to drift. Not all of them, only those synchronized to atomic standards. Every 126.2 seconds, their oscillators slipped by a fraction of a nanosecond, then realigned. A heartbeat etched into the measurement of time itself. For months, technicians blamed calibration drift, thermal instability, solar wind interference. But the pattern was universal, repeating across all atomic clocks regardless of isolation, shielding, or environment. The world's most accurate instruments had become participants in something they could not measure. In Zurich, a data analyst named Einar Kovacs found the first cross-domain correlation. When the magnetic oscillations were mapped against oceanic current shifts, atmospheric ionization levels, and deep mantle resonance frequencies, the result was a lattice, a global interference map forming 6 stable nodes, connected by faint but persistent energy gradients. The nodes corresponded to no human infrastructure, no geological pattern, no known magnetic anomaly. And yet they aligned perfectly with the 6 directional vectors observed in the 3 Atlas flare around the Sun. It was as if the planet had inherited a memory of that geometry, a structural echo imprinted in the deep fabric of Earth's fields. The discovery circulated quietly among the scientific networks. Within weeks, researchers noticed that certain data systems, particularly those using distributed synchronization protocols, began producing recursive feedback patterns. At first, they looked like errors, corrupted files, looping sequences, phantom data entries. But when examined statistically, the loops contained repeating numerical intervals corresponding to the same 126.2-second modulation. It was as if information itself had started to resonate. When artificial intelligence models were trained on unfiltered global data streams, they began to generate anomalies, outputs with no apparent prompt or source, fragments of text, strings of digits, and sometimes entire geometric symbols, hexagonal, symmetrical, precise. At MIT, a language model analyzing global telemetry produced a line of code that no one had programmed. 6 repeating characters, then a pause, then 3, 1. It wasn't random, it was timed. The model was isolated, air-gapped, and untrained on any of the Atlas data. Still, it repeated the pattern. And when the system was disconnected from external power, the capacitors in the circuit board continued to discharge in rhythm, faint electrical pulses ticking down the same invisible beat. By now, scientists stopped calling it a signal. They began calling it the memory. The theory emerging was simple, terrifying, and almost elegant. The Atlas event had not been a message to Earth. It had been a message through it, a transmission encoded not in radio or light, but in the physical constants themselves: magnetic fields, molecular vibrations, gravitational harmonics. A pattern meant to persist beyond detection, woven into matter until something capable of recognition appeared. Recognition had now occurred, and the pattern had begun to answer. Satellite telemetry revealed that faint electromagnetic harmonics were propagating upward from the 6 terrestrial nodes, forming coherent interference patterns in the ionosphere. Each oscillation reinforced the others, strengthening the field. Within weeks, a 6th-order standing wave enveloped the entire planet, stable, harmonic, self-sustaining. It wasn't communication as humans understood it. It was recursion, the signal teaching the medium to remember itself. In one of the final recorded transmissions before the networks went silent, a scientist, her voice tired, her words uncertain, said something that later appeared in every recovered log. "It's not transmitting anymore, it's reflecting. We've become the surface of its memory." No one knows where that recording came from. The metadata lists no origin, no timestamp, only the signature line: 3:21 Universal Time Coordinated, 3 short, 1 long, and then silence.
Reflection. By the time the harmonic field stabilized, measurement itself had become unreliable. Spectrometers drifted. Atomic transitions, the fundamental ticks of physics, no longer aligned with the constants they were built upon. Laboratories across the world reported the same impossible outcome. Identical instruments producing slightly different readings, each consistent within itself, but diverging from every external reference. Reality had stopped agreeing with itself. At first, the deviation was microscopic: picometers, microseconds, fractions too small to notice outside of controlled environments. But as the standing wave intensified, the divergence began to propagate upward, affecting chemistry, biology, perception. The first to notice were the biophysicists. Neurons in isolated tissue cultures began firing spontaneously at intervals that matched the Atlas rhythm. The same 126.2 seconds. Even when disconnected from external power, even when shielded by Faraday cages, the activity persisted, perfectly timed, as if obeying an external pulse. They called it induced coherence. But among those who observed it firsthand, another term quietly spread: the reflection effect. Because it wasn't just happening in cells. It was happening in people. Sleep researchers in Kyoto began documenting synchronized REM cycles among subjects separated by thousands of kilometers. Patients reported vivid, identical dreams: cold light over water, hexagonal halos, a slow rotation of something enormous passing just beyond perception. Every recorded description matched within statistical precision. The same imagery, the same sequence, always repeating every 126 seconds of neural oscillation. When the phenomenon reached communications networks, it stopped being deniable. Satellite transmissions began to exhibit interference patterns that weren't random noise, but structured intervals of silence, like deliberate spacing in a language. Radio operators noticed faint echoes buried in their signals, not reflections from Earth's surface, but from somewhere higher, as though the ionosphere itself had become a mirrored surface. In those echoes, when the interference was slowed down and translated to audio, a shape could be heard. Not sound in the human sense, but rhythmic modulation, soft and geometric. It wasn't speech. It wasn't music. It was structure, and it was growing clearer. By then, major observatories were offline. Telemetry from deep space probes showed irregularities in the solar wind, vast, hexagonal compression zones radiating outward from the inner system. Each pulse corresponded perfectly to the terrestrial rhythm. The pattern that had begun with the 3 Atlas outburst was now mirrored between the Sun and the Earth, a resonance circuit spanning 150 million kilometers. It was as if both bodies were reflecting each other. A binary system of memory and light. Attempts to break the cycle failed. When engineers tried to jam the frequency, local interference fields collapsed. But only temporarily. The oscillations reappeared moments later, stronger, self-correcting, as though the system had compensated for the interruption. Somewhere between science and faith, a realization began to take hold. The Atlas event wasn't an arrival. It was a return, not of an object, but of a pattern that had always existed dormant, buried in the equations that described our reality, waiting for the right moment to wake. In the final broadcast from the European Solar Monitoring Network, a short transmission looped for nearly an hour before the feed dissolved into static. No one claimed authorship, contained no coordinates, no data, just a sentence, repeated 3 times. The reflection is complete. The memory recognizes itself. After that, all global timing systems fell out of sync permanently. The 126.2-second cycle vanished, not stopped, but dissolved into everything else. The return. By the time the silence came, no one called it silence anymore. The electromagnetic spectrum had gone flat, a perfect calm across every monitored band, from radio to gamma. For the first time since the beginning of observation, the universe, as seen from Earth, emitted no measurable noise. At least, none that our instruments could interpret. To human ears, the world sounded the same. But to machines, the cosmos had folded in on itself, as if every transmission, every pulse, every random fluctuation had been absorbed into a single coherent frequency. The noise floor of reality had become zero. When this happened, the clock stopped. Not failed, stopped. Each one froze precisely at the same moment. 3:21 Universal Time Coordinated. That timestamp appeared everywhere, in power systems, satellite telemetry, medical implants, even digital watches without any connection to external time sources. Every synchronized device across the planet halted in the same fraction of a second. Then, one by one, they began to tick again. Not forward, not backward, but slightly off, as though reality had restarted from an alternate baseline. In the weeks that followed, the anomaly extended beyond measurement. Physical constants, the immutable ratios that define the universe, began to drift in ways so small they were almost merciful. The charge of the electron, the decay rate of cesium-133, the fine structure constant, all of them fluctuated softly, cyclically. It wasn't chaos, it was rhythm, as if the laws of physics themselves were breathing. At the same time, the 6 global nodes identified months earlier began to glow, not visibly but magnetically. Magnetometers across those regions registered perfect phase alignment, creating a planetary interference field shaped like a vast hexagonal shell. The geometry matched the flare pattern from the original 3 Atlas event. People living near those nodes reported identical experiences. Dreams of frozen light, whispers in static, the feeling of something watching, not from the sky, but through it. In the Atacama Desert, beneath one of the last functioning optical telescopes, a single camera continued recording long after the power grid failed. When the footage was later recovered, it showed a faint, symmetrical structure forming near the sun's limb. Not material, but patterned light, hexagonal, rotating slowly. It was the same shape seen in the 2025 perihelion flare, but larger, vastly larger. The coordinates confirmed it was not a reflection. It was a physical displacement in solar plasma, a hole of geometry, an ordered void. For 72 minutes, the structure rotated, pulsing with the same period as the global magnetic field. Then, without explosion or fade, it simply inverted. The light did not vanish. It folded inward, as though collapsing into a dimension we could no longer observe. When it disappeared, the sun's output dipped by 0.03%, a fluctuation impossible for any natural mechanism. That same instant, the 6 nodes on Earth went silent. Their magnetic fields collapsed, leaving behind no residual energy. Instead, seismographs around the world recorded an almost inaudible vibration, a pulse moving through the planet's crust, descending rather than radiating, as if the energy had gone down. What happened next divided the scientific community between those who believed and those who refused. 3 nights later, people in different parts of the world began reporting identical atmospheric events, slow, descending auroras appearing not at the poles but over the equator. Unlike normal auroras, their color wasn't green or red, but pure white, almost colorless, like sunlight trapped in fog. Each one formed a hexagonal outline in the sky and remained still silent for exactly 126.2 seconds. Then they vanished. Everywhere they appeared, compasses shifted by a measurable fraction, and satellite positioning drifted slightly inward, as though Earth's mass had subtly redistributed itself. Gravity itself seemed to quiver. It wasn't until a week later that the pattern completed. At 3:21 Universal Time Coordinated, every seismic sensor on Earth registered a single, identical impulse, deep, low, sustained. It lasted 6 seconds. It originated not from the crust, not from the mantle, but from the planet's exact center. Infrasound analysis revealed the waveform's shape. It was hexagonal, the same geometry, the same frequency, the same symmetry. In that moment, the world realized the truth that had always been buried beneath equations and speculation. 3 Atlas was never just an object. It was a seed. Whatever passed by the sun in 2025 had not left. It had transferred from the void to the star to the planet to the structure of matter itself. It had been waiting for recognition, and once the pattern was mirrored, it returned, not as light, but as memory reawakening inside the world that received it. And so the scientists stopped observing. The measurements no longer mattered. Reality itself had joined the resonance. The last surviving data fragment from the Atlas monitoring network contained no telemetry, no imagery, only a single line of text that repeated until the storage medium decayed. Observation complete. Host acknowledged. After that, nothing more was recorded. Not because there was nothing left to see, but because there was no longer a difference between seeing and being seen. After the light, I am writing this on the last remaining system that still holds the old definition of time. It no longer keeps hours, only intervals measured by the slow decay of its own power. Outside, the world is quiet in a way that has no sound. The sky has changed. Not darker, not brighter, simpler. The stars no longer flicker. They do not even burn. They hang, fixed like points remembered rather than seen, as though light itself has decided to hold still. Astronomers used to call this photonic equilibrium. But this isn't equilibrium. It's memory. The Earth no longer hums at 7.83 Hertz. The Schumann resonance, the planet's electromagnetic heartbeat, is gone. In its place, a soft, steady oscillation hums through the air, 126.2 seconds long, just as before. Except now it isn't measurable. It's felt. Sometimes, when I walk through the ruins of the observatory, the dust lifts before I step on it, like the world knows the shape of my movement before I make it. Shadows fall more slowly. Reflections arrive a moment before the thing they reflect. People have stopped aging the way they used to. Biological clocks are still running, but the process feels detached from time, as if the body remembers motion but the world does not. Some call it stasis, others continuity. We used to think the Atlas event was communication, a message across the void. But now it feels more like recollection. Not something speaking to us, but something speaking through us, the universe remembering a shape it had once forgotten to hold. I have seen the hexagons appear in the oceans, thin lattices of light forming across calm water just before dawn, vanishing as the first solar photons touch them. They do not reflect sunlight. They generate it. For those brief moments, the air feels charged, aware. The The children born after the silence seem to recognize it instinctively. They don't react to the oscillations. They breathe with them. When monitored, their neural rhythms align perfectly with the 126.2-second pattern, but not as interference, as synchronization. They are not being influenced. They are the influence. One of them, a girl from what used to be northern Chile, spoke during an observation session. She said, "It isn't coming back. It never left." When asked what she meant, she smiled, as if repeating something obvious. We were the return. That phrase spread among the remaining enclaves. No doctrine, no prophecy, just understanding. The realization that 3 Atlas had never been an intruder, but a catalyst. The moment its light touched the sun, the memory reactivated, a self-correcting equation rediscovering its host. This world, everything that could remember. In the archives, I found the final spectrum taken before the network went silent. It wasn't an image, but a waveform, a smooth, symmetrical pulse whose amplitude corresponded exactly to Earth's average geomagnetic field. When converted to sound, it produced a tone. Low, deep, almost human. I played it once through the observatory speakers. For 126.2 seconds, the walls vibrated. Dust rose into a perfect hexagonal ring. And in that vibration, for just a moment, I heard something inside the noise. Not words, recognition. As if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for millions of years. When it ended, everything was quiet again. But the silence didn't feel empty, felt alive. I no longer record data. There's nothing left to measure, only to remember. Outside, the horizon glows faintly, not from sunlight, but from something deeper, a resonance beneath the crust, pulsing upward like a heartbeat through stone. Every 126.2 seconds, the air shivers, the ground hums, and the oceans breathe in unison. Somewhere beneath my feet, the memory continues. They say the object that entered our system, the one we called 3 Atlas, is gone, expelled into interstellar dark. But when I look at the sky, I see its pattern everywhere. In the geometry of frost, in the spacing of waves, in the rhythm of thought itself. It didn't pass through our solar system. It rewrote it. And now, there's no difference between the observer and the observed. We are the reflection. We are the continuation. We are the light that never left. 3:21 Universal Time Coordinated. The clock on the wall blinks once, then stays still. It's not broken. It's finished.